So I took a walk the other day with the family down on the Leary because, well, it's really nice. And I was walking and we were at the pier, but it was the other pier. And we just commented on how many different boats there were sitting in the harbour. And it was cool, and the boats looked lovely. But as I was thinking to myself about the boats, well, they were sitting here not really doing what they were supposed to do. Boats aren't really made to sit in the harbour. They're made to be out in the ocean, kind of doing boaty things. Sailing, that would have been a better word, wouldn't it, than boaty things? And as I was thinking about the boats, I was thinking to myself, since this whole COVID thing, and maybe I'm wrong, yeah, right, but as I've been thinking about COVID, I think we've become a little bit like these boats. These boats, like, they look stuck. They're not where they want to be. And listen, we're stuck. We're kind of doing this. We're online. You're watching me on a screen. We're popping back on Zoom. And we miss being together, and we miss the connection. But ultimately, I think we've become like the boats in a few other different ways. You see, our faith is designed to be something that we put into action as well. Yes, we miss the connection, we miss being together, but ultimately God calls us into action whenever we are in relationship with Him. He wants us to live out our faith as well. So let me be totally honest with you. At times I find it really difficult to know what direction to take with us as I try and steer Youth Fellowship and the youth groups throughout this whole pandemic. On the one sense, I've tried to make sure that we stay connected in the things that we do, and I know it's been difficult, but God tells us to make sure that we do keep meeting together and that we're encouraged by one another and that we keep getting taught. And so we've tried to do that. I've also tried to make sure that I keep reminding us that we're loved ridiculously by God, even though at times it feels so strange in these times that we're in. But I really felt God say something different to me as I was thinking about where to go next. And that is that we live out our faith. That is that we don't become like those boats in the harbour, kind of stuck and not out doing what we're meant to be doing. And so as I thought about this and the sense that God was telling us to try and make sure we step out and act on our faith again, there was only one place in Scripture that I feel that we should go to. So that place in Scripture that came to my mind was James. Now, there's a few Jameses knocking around in the New Testament. We have a couple of Jameses who are disciples of Jesus, but that's not this James. This James was the half-brother of Jesus. And whenever I hear that, I always kind of wonder what that would have been like. I wonder what that would have been like being the half-brother of Jesus. Kind of knowing that your parents' favourite kid must have been your half-brother because, well, he was Jesus, right? So he had to be their favourite, or maybe not. I don't know. Anyway, James spent loads and loads of time with Jesus. He would have been with him traveling around the place. And if you flick through your New Testament, you'll see right towards the end, there's this little tiny letter called James. And James, in this letter, writes to a load of Christians who have been dispersed all over the place, well, because they've been persecuted. They've been separated from one another and separated and dispersed across the land. A little bit like us, except they've been dispersed away from their homes. Well, we've been dispersed out of this room and into our homes. And it was tougher for them. They faced real hardship. And although it's tough for us, they weren't really able to stay in touch with one another. And so James writes this letter to them to encourage them and to challenge them about living out their faith, even though times are really, really difficult. He writes to them and he quotes a lot of stuff that Jesus says in Matthew 5 to 7, which is the Sermon on the Mount. So he's using this experience that he had with Jesus. He's using all the knowledge that he had from going around with Jesus at the time. And he's also using stuff from this teaching in the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus would have said. And what he's doing is he's saying to them, listen, I know it's rubbish where you are, and I know it's tough. But he says to them, just because it's hard doesn't mean you bail on your faith. It doesn't mean that you stop living out how Jesus has called us to live. So the book of James, it starts like this. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded, unstable in all that they do. Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position. But the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wild flower. For the sun rises with a scorching heat and withers the plant. Its blossom falls and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away, even while they go about their business. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, having stood the test. That person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. So there's so much in those first 12 verses in the letter of James. So much different stuff that is really good for us to hear and to try and unpack. We could be looking at how James says that we should ask God for wisdom and he'll generously give it, and we should expect that. But if we doubt that, that's not a good thing. But we're not going to look at that. I want to look at 2 points here today. And the first one is this statement that James says is, consider it pure joy when you go through tough times. What a strange statement for us to hear. He says, consider it really joyful, consider it pure joy when you go through tough times. And that's especially weird for us to hear in the 21st century. When you consider how we get so many different messages from so many different places about how we should be happy all the time, that we should expect to be happy all the time, that we should want to be happy all the time, that we are entitled to be happy all the time. Advertisers sell us this kind of picture of if we have this, then it'll make us happy. Or sometimes we look at people's social media accounts and they post the best bits of their lives and we kind of think, oh, my life should look like that. My life should look perfect. My life should be happy. But James says here is that tough times are going to come. And he says, consider it joy. And the reason that he says that is he says, consider it joy because tough times bring about good things. Tough times bring about good things, especially in your faith. And so if you can remember who I said right back at the start of this, of who he's writing this to, he's writing this to a bunch of Christians who have been moved on from their homes because they're facing like death, they're facing persecution. And James is saying, don't look at this as all bad. He says, consider it pure joy that you're going through this because good things will happen. And so what are those good things? Like I said at the start, our circumstances are totally different to those who James is writing to. We haven't been dispersed away from our homes, but we've been dispersed into our homes. But the same message still applies because, well, I don't know about you, but I'm finding it tough. I'm finding it tough that we can't do our faith together the way that we like to do it and the way that it also helps us. It's hard. But the same thing that James is saying here is the same thing to those people as it is to us. He says, persevere. He says, if you persevere and keep going in your faith, then what will happen is that your faith will become stronger. And not just will you become stronger, but your faith will become more mature. Your walk with the Lord will grow. You will know what to do in other tough times coming down the line. And if you keep going, if you persevere, well, that's going to build a good thing in your faith. But here's the thing, right? Here's the challenge. To persevere, to keep going, it's not something that just happens. It's something that we choose to do. So he then makes this comment in verse 9 where he says that believers should take pride in their humble positions. That means that they should be content and be proud of the fact that they're not in a position that is high up. Now, again, let's think about who he's writing this to. He's writing this to people who have been spread out and dispersed, and they actually find themselves in positions which aren't good. But what he's saying is that take pride in this. He says that there are other people out there who are rich and they're powerful, but he kind of says to them as he writes this, he says, that's not going to last forever. He says that you should take pride in the position of knowing the Lord and it being where you are, and don't look at other people in their high, rich off positions and kind of be like seeking after that. And he says, don't be like that. Because, well, what they have and what they're putting all their focus in terms of their wealth and their business, all that kind of stuff, he says, don't be obsessed with that, because that stuff won't last forever. And again, it's very different to where we live and what we're living in. But on the other hand, how often do we look at people who have stuff that we don't have, or they're in a position that we aren't in, or they have X amount of followers, or this, that, or the other, and we kind of look, why can't I be like this? We kind of look at fame and wealth and popularity and riches and all those kinds of different things, and we can think, oh, that's where it's at. But in this passage in James, he writes, none of this stuff lasts. All that stuff that we see, well, it's all just going to be insignificant eventually. So he says to them to keep focusing on the thing that they know is true and good and that will last forever. So we see that James makes these 2 points, amongst other things in these first 12 verses. He says, look, persevere, keep going, because it builds your faith up. It matures your faith and it strengthens your faith. And then he says, don't be too concerned about the riches and the popularity and all the stuff that we see around us, because that stuff all fades. And again, that stuff that Jesus talked about. Remember whenever I said James talks about all this stuff because he's thinking about what Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount. And this is stuff that Jesus spoke about there as well. So he makes these 2 points, and then he brings these 2 points together when he gives us verse 12, and he says this. He says, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial. Having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. And so he's saying, look, keep going. Take pride in the position that you find yourself in. Don't be reaching for stuff that isn't going to last, because ultimately, when everything is done, the only thing that remains is him and you in him, and that is the most important thing. So we're going to spend the next number of weeks looking at James. James is this book which talks about the practical outworking of our faith. He looks at things like how we speak to each other. He looks at things like loving people who are hard to love. He looks at loving the poor, all these things that Jesus talked about. But the first thing that he tells us and encourages us to do is that when times are tough, is to keep on going, to persevere in our faith, because it builds our faith up.